Counsel Attorney, Mr. Carbo, the Chief of Staff, the Finance Director, and Scott, are you Deputy? What are you? Deputy Finance Director. We're having this meeting because during the last financial update we received from Mr. Collins, that he began to talk some about possible debt financing to be used in the construction of the new Civic Center arena. There were some questions with respect to that, and we decided it'd be best to have take that out of the city council meeting and have a finance committee for the purpose of setting what plans currently exist for that out, and so that the council might have some questions, understanding that nothing's been finally decided yet as to structure and timing. So I just asked Mr. Collins to make some opening comments.
Yes, sir. And thank you for the opportunity to speak to you guys today. Just a follow-up from the finance report that we had most recently. In discussing specifically the schedule for the bond issue for the Civic Center and some of the mechanics behind the scenes to get some of those things done. As we understand it now, the bond or the bids for the Civic Center will be opened in early February. We understand that the drawings are nearing substantial completion. We've already had meetings with qualified bidders, so that process is underway, and we think that everything will go to bid in January, and we'll get the bids returned or bid opening in early February. There have been some discussion previously about when we go to the market, when we borrow money and how much, and what will that process look like. What was decided on was we would prepare for the bond issue and all of the inner workings for that, but wait for the bond issue itself until we get the bids back. It just made sense to not go to the market and borrow money until we knew exactly what the financial obligation would be for the Civic Center itself. So with that, there are a couple of things that we're doing behind the scenes to make some things work. And then there will be a couple of asks we have for the city council as it relates to some regulatory matters that we'll need to address specific to the bond issue. The process for obtaining the bond is really twofold. First is the bond rating. As we sit here today, we're looking to have the rating completed in January. We'll have Standards & Poor's come into Mobile. They'll be here for a couple of days in January. They'll review everything as you would as if you're looking to get your own credit report. They come in, they look at your financials over the past couple of years, cash flows, budgets, operations, that sort of thing, and identify really what they believe the city can pay back if they were to go borrow money. The financials lead us to believe that the city could borrow money far in excess of what's going to be needed for the Civic Center. That's not a suggestion that we do that. It's just recommendation or discussion about the health of the city itself. So we will provide them some information before January. They'll come in, spend a couple of days here reviewing the financials, meeting with staff, visiting site, that sort of thing. Head back to New York, take a week, 10 days maybe, review that information and send us our bond rating back, and we should have that again late January. With that, we will also be putting together what's called a preliminary official statement. Preliminary official statement the tracking of that will be the same time that we do the bond rating itself. And the preliminary official statement is what goes out to the bond market to introduce them to the city of Mobile and the bonding itself. The preliminary official statement goes out and they look at that just as you would if you're looking to invest money in someone else. They look at that statement to determine whether or not they want to purchase those bonds. They review our business model. Typically, those are favorable. Municipal bonds are a little easier than other bonds, but they'll go review that, and prospective buyers will review that statement. So at the same time we're being rated, we'll complete that. Once we get the rating done, we'll send that statement out. The only thing we won't have at that time will be how much we're going to borrow. Once we get the bids back again, all of that goes into play, and that's a relatively quick process. Prior to that, there are a couple of things that we need to address for the city that makes it easier for the rating and the bond issuance. The first is the city's reserve policy. As we talked about at the finance report, the city currently has a policy where it holds reserves of 16.66%, 2 months, of the city's operating budget for the fiscal year. The necessity for that being codified or put in ordinance form is an assurance to the borrowers or the people who will purchase these bonds that the city has the resources on hand that are not typically used for any other thing. They're secure in the event there were to be a downfall in the economy, and the city could survive that thing such that there were dollars available that wouldn't hurt their ability to repay the bonds. So that's that ordinance itself, the reserve ordinance. The other document is not an ordinance, but a resolution. It's yes, sir.
The 2-year reserve, I mean, the 2-month reserve is currently is a city policy, but not an ordinance.
That's correct.
And the administration will seek us to pass an ordinance codifying that.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Is there a state law requirement with reserves?
There is a state law requirement specific to the city of Mobile, and it's 2%. You often hear that referred to as the Zogby Act or a Zogby Reserve. That act requires that we have a 2% reserve. The current policy since 2014, or the policy was enacted in 2014 and amended in 2019, provides that we have 2 months reserve instead of 2%. We're simply requesting that we codify that 2 months to protect that so that the bond rating agencies and prospective bond purchasers would be comfortable in that reserve amount. So the second part of that would be a resolution, a refunding resolution. What that resolution does is give the city the ability to refund itself money spent on the project before the bond proceeds are received. You may or may not want to refund money to yourself. That's kind of a game time decision. If you go to the bond market, you get the bids back, and let's say that the bids come in high, and you're going to use most of the bond proceeds for the construction of the Civic Center. In that instance, you would not want to refund yourself any dollars because you're going to spend most of those dollars on the construction project. If the bids were to come back low and you go to the bond market, then you may want to reimburse yourself for the cost of money spent. In this case, it will be on the site currently. So you could refund those dollars and make your cash position whole from where you were. The reason that's important is the refunding resolution has to be in place prior to the issuance of the bonds. Part of the refunding requires that you state what you're going to do if you're going to refund yourself for that or give yourself the opportunity. So you can't issue the bonds and then refund yourself after the fact. You have to state your desire to have that opportunity at the time the bonds are issued. So
You go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And you said this will be a resolution.
yes, sir.
So do we have any policies already in place similar to this?
No, sir. That resolution is specific to each individual bond issue. So for each individual bond issue, you'd have to pass that resolution
For each
separately.
one?
Yes, sir.
Mr.
Scott, are these refunding resolutions common
Yes,
in
sir.
bond issues such as this?
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
I don't know of municipal bond, especially when you're working on a specific project.
Right.
If you're doing just a standard customary bond issue, I believe the county does recurring bond issues for projects that they do. In that instance, you wouldn't refund that because those are ongoing. If you have a specific project for specific use, yes, sir, you would want to pass that resolution.
Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Let's do this. Mr. Carroll, you got any questions?
I'm sure I have some later. I was encouraged to see the actual refunding resolution. Last time I was here, we didn't do that. If the market comes back lower than expected, that gives us a chance to actually pay ourselves back for our expenditures from our unfunded liability, or our not liability, but our unfunded balance that we've been using, which then in turn give us an opportunity to continue to go after some of the major capital projects that we've been talking about, which then that takes a whole lot of pressure off us for the first 3 years of the bond issue that we've been talking about, if we can actually get there. But again, it just depends on what the return is or what numbers we get after we go to market. So and the other thing is timing. we've been talking about the timing of the issue, and I kept hearing for a while that we're talking about early January and being prepared so that we're ready to go to market in there early January, so we don't continue to push our start dates back. But it seems to me, listening to you, that we have some slippage in our schedule somewhere based on what I'm hearing from you now, talking about we won't have an answer to where we're going to be until late January. So what's causing the slippage in the schedule here?
Again, that slippage is based simply on the returning of the bids themselves. I know there's some, and I think Sam is here, you could probably answer that more appropriately than I can. From the financial side of that, that's just an effort to be cautious. We just simply don't want to go to market before we know what that number is. The internal discussions that we've had is even with that date being backed up from pushback from January to February, we don't think that's going to have an adverse effect on the overall project. There was a little bit of wiggle room in there. I think if we got into another, 2 or 3 month setback, that may be problematic. But as we sit here today, we think that schedule will hold, especially if we go through the process of bids returned and that date comes in. We're prepared to go to the market the next week. Bond proceeds come to us. We would typically have proceeds in the bank within 10 to 15 days, and then you approve the construction contract to move ahead. So,
Sam, how much actual float do we have in the schedule right now from pre-construction services until actual bid and award contract, or bid and award, so we'll know how much we have to go to market for?
Hey, Sam, come on up here and speak in the.
From now through the receipt of bids, we've got 2 weeks of float left.
So we're
So-
actually gonna burn up all of our float time, and by the time we get to the bond acquisition is what we're saying. So we're gonna start off with a later date than what we had originally anticipated, is what I'm hearing.
Well, the bonds are not my specialty, so I can't answer any
So
of
our
that.
start
But
date's gonna be.
my start date of construction has not slipped.
Okay.
In a pre-meeting before this one, to your question, Mr. Carroll, is Sam wants to allow the people bidding on this project as much time as he possibly can so that we get a very accurate bid and don't rush that process. And so we have a very firm number when we actually put it out to bid. And I think we're allowing, was it 60 days to get that? I think it's about 6 weeks. Okay. To give the contractors time to really give us a good bid.
Any other questions, Mr. Carroll?
Like I said, I'll probably have a ton later. Our process changed a little bit in this too. You're telling me that there's no other requirement by the redevelopment authority or anybody else to approve us going after these municipal bonds. Like in the past, we can do this solely on our own without following the original process or the process in the past. Is that not correct also?
yes, sir. In this instance, you would not be required to meet with any of those partners or go through that process. This is a City Mobile only bond with none of those partners, or there would be no partners on the project. So the City of Mobile is free to issue these on their own without those partnerships or regulations.
Oh, wait.
Mr. Reynolds?
So in considering how much we'll need a bond for, we're talking about price, of course, of the total project, but we have to be considerate of other contributors to the project. So for example, sponsorships, all of those sort of things, other partners.
Yes, sir.
When will we see who's going to participate with the City of Mobile?
That I do not know. We in the finance department have not gotten any confirmation from any financial partners to date. That doesn't mean they're not there. There could be negotiations that are ongoing. For our part, we've been solely focused on the bids being returned and what the total finance project would be.
So if we get a price back of $300 million and we go to the bond market, we get $300 million now set aside for us, and we have partners that come on board and say, eat up $150 million or $100 million of that. We're still on the hook for that debt of $300 million. Would we, if they were participating, make a payment towards principal of the bond?
No.
So we would just continue, we'd have $300 million sitting around.
Correct. So in that instance, so let's assume that discussion is there. So when you issue the bonds, unlike in years past or times past, when you go to issue bonds, you're going to state that it's for the purpose of the Civic Center. There is language available that you can issue bonds for the Civic Center and like or similar capital projects. So in that instance, you would have the ability to either bank that cash and put it away. We can't refund the bonds for a period of at least 8 years, likely 10 years. And that's just bond rules, regulations 101. So once we go issue bonds, we're going to be held to that debt for at least 10 years, possibility of 8, but that requires a little different movement. So with that, you could bank that money and simply pay that money back at the end of that term whenever the refunding opportunity arises, or you can use those additional funds for other capital projects as long as it's identified as such when you issue the bonds, which is 2 paragraphs in the bond issue itself. So it just depends on what you give those projects partners at that time.
Where are we at knowing where our partners are? Who's going to participate in funding this? And I would prefer not to take out 300 million if we only need 200 million.
Certainly.
So when are we going to know? I mean, we're making a decision on how much in February, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, in February.
Yes, sir.
So we're going to know by then?
So by partners, do you mean local?
Sponsorship partners,
Okay.
whatever else we can draw down on the amount that we have to go to the bond market.
Certainly.
You know, our cash contribution,
Right.
you know, our general fund money, sponsors,
Yes.
you know,
So I'll start with the latter. Cash contribution is relatively easy. We'll just identify at that time what's our cash in the bank and what we want to put into the project. That will be the easiest part. On the sponsorship partners, I believe there has been in place for some time a contract with someone who does some of that work for the city or has done or at least engaged in that. I don't know the status of what that is. It's not been brought to the finance department that we have any naming sponsor partners at this time. Doesn't mean that there aren't some final discussions in the works. I just haven't seen what those are. The other will be conversations with local partners. In this case, the county, right? So once we get closer to time and we have a final number for the anticipated cost through the designs, and I think that will be reasonable to go have those conversations with the county prior to the bids being open and at least understand what their opportunities are to participate in that.
and then we would make those decisions or at least settle on something prior to, you know, putting out for bond a dollar amount.
Yes, sir.
So the question of how much will be decided based on commitments at that time or expected commitments, or do we float it with our cash until we get, you know, other commitments?
I think we
Instead of
would
taking out 300 million and then setting aside an account and then, you know,
certainly.
government can spend it on some other projects down the road.
That's
Yes.
I kind of want to avoid that.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Agreed.
You know, some of it, we're still trying to negotiate the OVG commitment to this project. I think what you'll have when they come to you with the bond issue, Rick, is an actual cash stack on how that cash stack looks, be it the bond, be it the city's commitment, the county's commitment, and, you know, OVG's commitment up front. Sponsorships can actually span several years, and so it's not always upfront money. But it could go toward debt service on how we're going to service debt. And so we'll be able to show you both what the cash stack looks like to pay for the project, including the bond amount, and then also how that debt service will look going forward.
Okay, and just make sure I get to the core of the question is that cash stack where your various contributors will be represented.
Right.
And including the bond amount.
Yes.
That bond amount that we're going to actually get or request money for is going to be only the amount necessary above and beyond the remaining cash stack.
That's right. The mayor's instructions was borrow as little as possible on the bond, you know, using the cash stack city's contribution for as short a period of time as possible. So maximum of 20 years with a plan to pay it off even sooner than that.
Okay. Thank y'all.
Anything else? Mr. Reynolds?
I think the only thing I'd like to add to this is we originally put together the cash stack and we were showing going to market probably in the 200 to 220, not at a 300 level. And that included a couple of components. It was one contribution that OVG was going to bring to the table. Their cash comes in over the first couple of years of the project. So part of that money will be used to offset the repayment of the interest at that time. So their portion will largely be used against interest in the early part of the project. The other component was we had 50 to 70 million cash that we were putting in. And as interest rates change, as the market is changing, as our information, as we get closer to February and we know exactly what's going to be required, that number could be 200, it could be 220, but what does the debt service on that look like, and what's going to be in our best interest as far as how much we borrow and how we pay that back?
Yeah, so to how we pay it back, what is the expectation of how we will pay it back?
So if you look at the debt load of the city, as we're sitting today, our debts, our overall debt service is around 34 million a year. The debt service on the new debt, we've looked at the model that we're leaning toward on this will be a wrap debt service. So during the period, we have some of our debt rolling off in 2028. All of the legacy debt will be paid off in 2030. So during that time, we will be paying interest only. And once we get to 2030, we will be rolling on the interest and the principal, and the overall debt service will be lower than our current debt service.
So we'll be paying it back out of the general fund.
Correct.
And that's also provided that no other administration comes in and adds to the debt.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, that's a lot to consider here. I mean, depending on what the next administration looks like.
That'll be the decision for another city council.
I'm hearing you extremely loudly, Chairman Days, but that's a lot to consider, considering that someone coming in may have some agenda items that they want to see taken care of too, on top of the debt that we already have.
So, Mr. Chairman, there's going to be revenue. I mean, this is going to be a revenue generating asset for us as well. That is the expectation, correct?
Correct.
And there will be which I think we've already agreed to, a participation agreement with OVG that, we're going to get revenue off of this new asset as well.
There will be new revenue, and keep in mind, we've been running a civic center at a $2 million a year
Yes.
loss.
That's right.
2.5.
So we're immediately going to eliminate that.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Rick, just to make sure that everybody understands, in addition to paying off the long-term debt, the existing long-term debt, we also will have brought the police and firefighter pension plan into balance at some time during the next
That
6 or
is the
7 years.
portion that comes off in 2028.
And that's how much? Just that? But that's part of the 30, was that included in the 30 something million?
That is part of it. And that number right now, and it varies depending on
Right, yeah,
performance
yeah.
in the market, but you're probably looking in the 10 million range.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Penn?
Thank you, Chairman. You stated that in 2030 that the debt ratio will be lower than what it is currently, even with the Civic Center.
The debt service will be lower.
Debt service will be lower. So until 2030, do we know that amount? Would it be
We are currently around 34 million.
even with the Civic Center, because of we won't be.
No, that will be bumping up. There are components that, again, OVG will be contributing to pay off some of this interest. The other thing that will work into that, even though we have to, for safe harbor, we have to keep our interest below our expense. but we will be, once we take the bond money in, that money will be invested. We will be getting interest payments on that, and that will work into the formula.
Okay. So we don't have, so right now till 2030, we don't have the exact number of what the debt services will be.
Not until we know how much brown cow weighs.
Okay.
Not
Can't do
knowing
it.
how much
Yeah.
we're
Gonna
going to
exactly.
borrow. No.
Yeah. Okay. I was just wondering if we did any different projections for different amounts, like where we would be at if we were to.
We've done a lot of different models, but between the dollar amount and the interest rates, it's hard to give you an exact number.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Woods?
Yes, sir. I just have a couple procedural questions. Going back to the ordinance, we're going to be setting that, setting our reserve, I guess, with the ordinance. That therefore is going to impact the debt rating or the bond rating that we're going to get. Just out of curiosity, I'm obviously, got the initial rating. Over the course of 10 years before, repayment option comes up, if, should we want to pay it all off and all that fun stuff. If future councils change that ordinance, decrease the amount going from 16.5, is it?
16.6.
And said, maybe we feel more comfortable just setting back to 8. Is the only issue there. We're not going to be violating the city would not be violating, I guess, any bond documentation, or would it just really impact the credit rating, I guess? If future councils change the ordinance that we're going to input.
So,
Yeah.
neither.
Okay.
If they were to go back and change that, it wouldn't have an adverse effect on what you've done currently. It may have an adverse effect if the city were to issue debt a second time
New debt. Okay.
and go through there. And then as a follow-up to Councilman Carroll's question, there is a provision when you go issue bonds or issue debt that you have to state assertively if the city is going to borrow any other money for a certain period of time. Typically, it's not less than 24 months, but you have to identify what that is. So there is some protection in going back and asserting that the city has no plans or intentions to issue debt for a certain period of time beyond this debt, which slows an incoming council's ability to go back and issue debt on top of that, at least for a window.
Well, in our case, it'd be the incoming administration, mayor handles finance and council approves the budget, so it'd be on the administration to do that. That's why it was a concern of mine, depending on what the next administration looks like.
Certainly.
But if they were going to take on any new debt, they'd have to come to the city council.
I just said that, Joe.
No, it's not exactly what you said.
I
But
said the council has to approve the debt, but the administration controls the budget.
And then also
But-
going to the resolution, and I'll throw it out there to let you talk. The resolution, so I guess we're looking, will that be executed before? Will we need to execute that before or after we kind of get the final number on that? Do we need to make the decision before or after we determine whether or not we're going to repay ourselves? I guess?
We'll do that before.
Okay.
My goal is to have the resolution and the ordinance adopted by council no later than January 7th.
Okay.
On the reimbursement resolution, it's a fairly simple document. What you do have to include in that is the going backwards date you would want to refund yourself from.
Up to.
Typically 6 months or so. So you could go back and say, for this project, we're interested or want to have the ability to refund ourselves for dollars expended on or after August 1st or whatever that date is.
And would that resolution give the administration the authority to make the decision to refund or not, or would that question need to come back to council?
It
for
would still
approval?
go back to council.
Okay.
When those dollars are done, if there's going to be a reimbursement, then you would have to do the reimbursement by resolution
Okay.
as well. You give yourself the ability to do that by resolution, and then you actually do that by second resolution if that was chosen to be done.
And that should answer some of your questions.
I got a
That's
question specifically.
we're going to come back around. So do you have any questions, CJ? Okay, hold on for a minute. So we'll go back to, okay.
It was just specifically on the reimbursement resolution and our projected cash position down the road. Do you anticipate a situation where we expend a significant amount of our cash, say on other projects, where it's the animal shelter and all these projects that are not funded, so that it would be, say, a necessity for us to reimburse ourselves for expenditures on the civic center?
As we're sitting here today, I don't. But you want to have that privilege should come before you. As we start looking at other projects and other opportunities, if we were able to get, let's take the animal shelter or some other thing, if there's an opportunity that those costs could be reduced from what was projected before, and you can use what was previously your cash in the bank to complete those, then that may be something that you would be encouraged to do. So I don't anticipate we would do that, but I certainly would encourage you to leave that window open.
Yeah, we wouldn't deplete our reserves past the 16.66%, so long as the ordinance was established, or if it was y'all's policy anyways.
Yes, sir.
But you also would say that we're not, there's no plan or intent to deplete the remaining cash to a, say, unacceptable level.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, the
When
opposite.
this administration turns over the keys to the castle to the next administration,
Right.
there's still an expectation we'll be in a very good cash position.
Yes, sir. And we will kind of looking forward 9 months or so. We're going to address that when we present the budget for 2026. The budgeting process that you will see before you will include beginning and cash balances year over year. We've talked about unassigned fund balances and all those things are what those mean. So when we get into the 26 budget, you will actually see your beginning cash, revenues, expenditures, ending cash for each year, so that we make sure we don't do exactly what you just suggested, which was go back and spend that. There'll be visibility on what those deposits are. Yes, sir.
You know, he touched on some of the outline questions, and I was trying to recall the budget in my head while I was sitting here. Taking into consideration all the projects that we have that we're actually and have actually expended funds on, or are we looking for those projects to now go stale in the water, like Berkeley by the Bay, the animal shelter, all those other projects? Are they going to go stagnant along with the expenditures we've already made on them based on what we're about to do with this bond issue?
I do not believe so.
So I don't recall space in the budget where there's expenditures in the upcoming year, or I don't recall seeing specifically numbers that are allocated towards those projects.
Right.
So I'm asking, are they going to go stagnant a year, or are they going to get delayed? What are we doing to accommodate what we've already started before we're looking at this bond issue?
So you may recall there was an email that went out to all of you a couple of weeks ago about a top 5 projects that we wanted to complete. Excuse me. So the capital department and I, along with real estate, have gone through and done a pretty exhaustive review of the list of those projects. I believe most recently, if you look in the project management system, there were a total of 429 projects that were in somehow underway or funded. We're working to go back and put a revised plan for those together so we can see an accomplishment or completion of those to the extent that we can. I think what's complicated the matter in years past is the discussions about what are CIP funds toward a project and what are, quote, city funds in a project. And then those have their own little mini projects within the system. As recently as last week, we've talked about putting a plan together, and we think we're close on this, so that regardless of the source of funds, once a project is funded, then we will go through the life of that project and include all deposits as in total for that project. That means that, let's take a Berkeley by the Bay or animal shelter or some other thing. We're going to go back and look at those projects in their entirety as a whole project and identify where those are, and then put a business model together going forward for each of those. That business model will be each of the projects, as we know, and then a total business plan for all the capital. As you're aware, under the ZABI Act, the financial rules, any money that goes toward a capital project, once that project is funded, it has to have some activity within 36 months. If it does not have activity within 36 months, those funds go back to the pool, so to speak, to start over. What Railia and Capital is doing and what real estate is doing right now is going back and auditing each one of those 400 some odd projects that we have for the initial beginning date of that project and auditing activity through last week. Once we're able to get those calendars, we'll come back with a revised calendar for this council for each of those projects to understand where we are when we get to the spring. So we've tried to take a sort of a global approach to all the projects, understanding that we're on kind of a 12-month window of time for elected officials and staff as we know it. And we want to make sure that we accomplish as much of we can, either through real items taking place or a sustainable business model for each of those projects.
Anybody else? Okay, thank you very much. When should the finance, is it too early to set a follow-up meeting when you're going to be in a position maybe to give us some additional information, like maybe end of the year, first part of January or something? I mean, when would be a good time for the finance committee to meet when you'll have more facts under your belt?
I would like to do it before the end of the year. If we could look at a December meeting, I think that even if we pick 4 weeks from today or whatever that date is, I think that will give us enough time to at least have most of the design for Civic Center back, have somewhat of a realistic idea of what we think that would be, and then be able to get some visibility on these other projects.
The 10th of December? Is that too early?
No, sir.
Scott,
Mr. Chairman, can I make a suggestion?
Yeah, sure.
That if Scott in the monthly finance report, will just give us a brief update, between now and say February.
Certainly.
Not necessarily aimed at, provoking some large conversation, but just a reminder sort of update.
Yeah.
And then that may trigger
Wow.
a meeting like this.
What does everybody else say about that? I tell you, Ben, I think the thing is so complicated and intricate, and there's so many moving balls around it that my sense would be better off to go ahead and have another finance committee meeting.
I agree with that too. Scott, I would like to know what the true value of those 406 projects are that you say that we have moving. Or did you say 406? 446?
419, I think.
419.
When you say true value, you mean anticipated total dollar value, or?
I would like to
Define.
know, true value means actual cash or value spent to date, and then actual value of project earned at completion, meaning that what have we spent today and what's the projected value of the project at end? Because I'm sitting here trying to do math in my head, and I'm getting to this year-end thing. It seems to me that there are going to be some projects that we've promised the citizens of Mobile that may down the line based on what this administration can accomplish in the next 12 months. And then based on the next administration's want or desire to continue the projects that we already have in place.
Sure.
So I'd like to know what that value is, because, once upon a time, there was a rule that we didn't start to do a project unless we had all the funding in place. So I kind of want to know where we are.
And theoretically, too, some of these projects might already be completed. So that's kind of what you're verifying too, is where the movement is, what's left to be percentage to complete, I guess.
So for that level of work, and I won't bore you with the behind the scenes details, although I can if you like, that may be, for that report, that's probably a January report. And I can give you the details of why that is if you care to hear it. But for that level, I would request January instead of December, and I can explain to you why.
Well, that's fair enough. I think the chairman's going to ask for another finance committee meeting anyway in January. I mean, that's fine. But I think we owe it to the citizens of the city, where there's some projects that they're thinking that are coming that we might need to be extremely honest that this administration ain't going to be able to get there, or they are going to be able to get there. So I think that knowing that information would be of value to everybody sitting at this table.
There appears to be a conflict with December 10th.
When did CJ decide to do the last meeting of the year?
This one's 17.
The 17th, okay. So it could 10 or 17, Joe.
What's the conflict on the 10? At 1:15.
So we have the 3rd at 2 o'clock is available after the update from public school system.
It might be too early. That's only a week.
Yeah.
2 weeks. Well, I was going to say, why don't we push it later in the day? I don't mind it. 2:30.
2:30.
On the 10th.
Okay.
Okay.
So just from my understanding, on the 10th, is all things Civic Center complete as we know it on that day.
Right.
January is capital generally.
That's right.
Okay.
And if you could have some type of broad and comprehensive idea of capital in general on the 10th would be nice.
Yes, sir, it would be. And well, I'll do my best for us to put that together. That may be a heavy lift in just a few weeks.
Okay, thank you very much. The next one is 2:30 on the 10th. Okay, we're adjourned.
We've got money expended on all those projects. We've got, no, on Brookwood Bottom Bay, we've already spent. We got design, concept,